And welcome to this Watching Brief special bulletin, which is a sort of insert in between our regular Watching Brief shows and some specials which we've got coming up very, very shortly, which we're really excited about. So watch this space. Before I start as well, wherever you're watching, please like and subscribe to the platform, to our channel on the platform. And if you're on YouTube, certainly like and subscribe to the Watching Brief channel. And if you can have a look at the Archaeosoup Patreon or buy the Pipeline of Kofi, Mark and I will be very appreciative. This story is something we wanted to bring you separately because it pertains to some work which we've done, some stories that we've covered on the Watching Brief really since the get-go, which is over 10 years now, which is to do with the looting of historic shipwrecks. There are far too many stories of the looting for commercial reasons, primarily, of historic shipwrecks of all periods. But one of the issues we've looked at particularly is the looting of military shipwrecks from World War I and World War II. We looked at, for example, at the case of HMS Queen Mary, a battle cruiser that was sunk at the Battle of Jutland in 1916 and was looted by a Dutch salvage company. And we looked at who and how and why. And then more recently, we've looked at things like the looting of British and Dutch ships on the Pacific Rim, or in the Java Sea, Malaysia. And in particular, you might remember, and we'll link to it below the line, but a story that we covered about work that had been done showing that a Chinese flagged crane barge, the Chuanghong 68, had been involved in looting, in particular, HMS Prince of Wales, a British battleship that was sunk in December 1941, along with another ship, HMS Repulse, and over 800 Royal Navy mariners were killed. So those sites, along with many of these sites, are, although they don't have a legal status as war graves, many people regard them not just as historical monuments, which they are to the events that led to them being now on the seabed, but also as the grave sites and the monuments to the members of the crew who were lost with them. So it's a very sensitive area, and many people find the looting of this kind of ship deeply offensive. And in fact, in some jurisdictions, there are protections in place. There is something called the UN Salvage Convention, which should prevent salvage companies salvaging military shipwrecks that were lost on active service. They're regarded as what's called sovereign immune, which means basically you mustn't touch them without the permission of the country that owns them, what's called the flag state. That has been completely ignored in the case of, for example, the Prince of Wales. Now, why does this happen? There's been a long-standing suggestion, assertion, and you find it in much of the media coverage of the looting of these ships, that it's to do with what's called pre-nuclear steel, or sometimes it's called low background steel. The idea being that steel that was manufactured before the first atmospheric explosion of a nuclear weapon in July 1945, the Trinity test, and then the explosions of the atom bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the subsequent atmospheric tests by the United States, Britain, Soviet Union, China, and others, until the atmospheric test ban treaty, partial test ban treaty in 1963. The steel manufactured before the atmosphere had those nuclear pollutants put into it was in demand from certain parts of industry, because the low background radiation meant that it could be used in sensitive constructions like medical instruments, scientific instruments for measuring radiation, that kind of thing. You often see this asserted in articles, including articles in quite respectable news outlets that report these particular issues. It's always been sort of word on the street. It's never actually been looked at in detail and in a forensic sort of way. It now turns out, thanks to an article that's just been published in the UK Defence Journal, which is an online journal which primarily deals with defence issues, as you can imagine. An article published in the UK Defence Journal asked the question, is pre-nuclear steel behind World War II ship targeting? And the answer that the three researchers have come up with is basically, in all probability, not. Now, the research has been done by, well, the article is signed off by three people. Jessica Berry, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Maritime Archaeology Sea Trust, which is a UK-based maritime archaeology charity. The COO, Chief Operating Officer at MAST, Giles Richardson, and also a British government nuclear scientist, Lawrence Jones, who's an expert in the field of radiation measurement, and has been doing working in that field for over 20 years. The work has come out of work with an organisation called the Maritime Observatory, which is a partnership between MAST and another not-for-profit called Ocean Mind. And basically, they've been looking at this whole issue of unauthorized salvage. They looked particularly in this case at the evidence for whether steel from ships like Prince of Wales was going for this purpose. And if people are interested, look back on the watching brief that we did with Giles Richardson about 18 months ago, when they published the work linking Chuan Hong 68 with the theft of metals from HMS Prince of Wales, or sorry, the illicit salvage of metals from HMS Prince of Wales. Basically, taking that as a starting point, they looked at whether there's a supply chain, whether there's a demand, whether this can actually be proven, and it turns out it can't. They report, for example, rumours that NASA satellites use steel from Scapa Flow, the German ships that were scuttled in Scapa Flow in 1919, but they could find no primary evidence that that had happened. They point out as well, and this is where the work of Lawrence Jones comes in, that actually the issues around background radiation in instruments can actually be dealt with in the manufacture of steel anyway. You don't need to get steel that was manufactured before July 1945 to actually achieve the kind of low background readings that you need for those kind of sensitive instruments that it was alleged that the material was needed for. They point out that, for example, an Italian experiment into researching dark matter used commercial steel sources, and they were able to source steel with low contamination levels. Similarly, a Chinese experiment in neutrinos. And they also point out that there are sort of logical issues around this. For example, why would people involved in sensitive scientific and medical research take the risk of using a material that came from a disreputable, unprovable almost source? They also point out that actually, if you pull steel off the seabed, it has to be remanufactured anyway before you can use it. So overall, it looks like, based on the work that the three authors have come up with, we may be dealing with what is effectively a marine salvage maritime archaeology urban myth, but it's one that has gained real traction in the media, and we'll see whether this article, and they're hoping to, I've spoken with the authors, and they're hoping to place it with an academic journal of record in the near future. But in the meantime, there's a comprehensive article out there on the UK Defence Journal, which cites their evidence. But basically, it looks like once again, archaeologists have been involved in undercutting a very attractive, quite sort of romantic urban myth. Now, whether putting this urban myth to bed will have any effect on the policy towards the looting of shipwrecks is another matter. It's again the main work of Ocean Mind is monitoring and trying to investigate these kind of activities. If it's just about commercial greed, which it primarily seems it now is, obviously we're dealing with matters of political policy and law enforcement, and whether the authorities in the various jurisdictions concerned are actually, and the owners of the ships for that matter, like the British Royal Navy, whether they're actually prepared to assert their legal rights under the UN Salvage Convention and so on, and get this illicit trade stopped. There are other complicating factors, like, for example, Prince of Wales lies off the coast of Malaysia in an area which is very sensitive in geopolitical terms because of the activities of China. And so political factors weigh in, as well as heritage factors and moral factors, actually, because as I said at the beginning, we're dealing with what many people would regard as grave sites and memorials. So that's it for this Watching Brief bulletin. Hopefully we'll be back soon with a Watching Brief and some exciting Watching Brief specials. See you next time.